It was supposed to be a fresh start, a new city, a new job, and a hopeful beginning. But I never imagined my life would take this twist. When I saw her, that intense look in her eyes, I felt an inexplicable pull, as if fate had dropped me into a world I didn't belong in. At first, it was just a curious glance, a fleeting thought, but that spark turned into something I couldn't resist. She was someone else's wife, but the line between right and wrong blurred faster than I thought possible. Now, I'm trapped in something I can't escape from. My name's Michael, and I'm 24. San Diego became my new home after college, and while the city offered me freedom and change, it also handed me a loneliness I didn't expect. I'd found a decent job as a marketing associate, but it was the free gym membership that came as the unexpected perk that started this story. I remember the first time I saw her. It was after an early workout one Tuesday morning. I was wrapping up a few sets, breathing heavy, when a group filed down the stairs from the studio above. Among them was a striking woman, lean, with long dark hair, around 40. She carried herself with this confidence, like she owned the room without even trying. Next to her was a younger woman, probably just 18 or 19, with similar features, same long dark hair, same eyes. They looked so alike that I assumed they were mother and daughter. I kept my eyes on them as they moved across the gym, my curiosity turning into something else. I watched the older woman's posture, the way she spoke to those around her, and I couldn't help but feel drawn in. I overheard someone say her name, Teresa Hollins. Teresa taught several fitness classes at the gym, and by the look of things, she was popular. I found out her daughter's name was Jenna, and that she was in her last year of high school, about to head off to college. I didn't approach them that day. In fact, I didn't expect to see them again. But the next week, they were there in matching outfits, a detail I later learned wasn't an accident. They seemed to enjoy the attention they got, both from the gym staff and from people like me who couldn't help but stare. I felt a little awkward, like I'd been caught staring, but then Teresa noticed me. She didn't look away. Instead, she gave me a slight smile, one that lingered. Eventually, Jenna came over to say hi. She was funny, energetic, and easy to talk to. She told me about how her mom was always the fun one, even when she was strict. Jenna was an only child, raised in an affluent family. Her dad, Tom, ran a chain of car dealerships, and they lived in an upscale neighborhood just outside the city. As we talked, Jenna hinted that her parents had a strange marriage, saying her dad was nice but absent, always buried in work. She didn't seem to mind. She was close with her mom, and they were more like best friends than mother and daughter. After several conversations with Jenna, Teresa finally joined in. We chatted about harmless things at first, my job, her fitness classes, Jenna's college plans. Teresa had this way of making every conversation seem interesting, like she was genuinely curious about everything I had to say. I'd been single for a while, and I could feel that old spark coming to life. But there was a line here, a line I'd be crossing if I let my thoughts go further. Then one day, after a class, Jenna invited me to grab a smoothie with her and her mom. We went to a small cafe nearby, and I couldn't help but notice how comfortable Teresa was, how she leaned in just a bit closer than necessary when we talked. I felt myself becoming more captivated, more interested, but I didn't let on. Teresa laughed and chatted, but there was something in her eyes, a curiosity, maybe even a hint of desire. I couldn't tell if it was real or if I was imagining it. Still, I couldn't deny the thrill that came with every casual touch, every word. One Saturday, Jenna invited me over to their house for a cookout. When I arrived, I was stunned by the place. Tall, modern architecture, manicured lawns, and a large pool in the backyard. Jenna greeted me, pulling me into a hug like we'd known each other for years, and introduced me to her dad, Tom. Tom was a short man, rounder than I expected, with a pleasant, easygoing smile. He worked a lot, but his efforts had clearly paid off. The way he looked at Teresa, though, was different. There was admiration, even love, but it felt distant. He was a man who had found comfort in his success, but who maybe didn't understand the people he shared his life with as well as he thought. That day, the family dynamic came into focus. Teresa took over the grill, chatting with me and teasing Jenna about her music taste, her fashion choices. At one point, Teresa looked at me and said, "You're a breath of fresh air around here, Michael." I felt myself flush, and Jenna rolled her eyes, laughing. Tom was in and out, busy with something work-related, his phone buzzing every few minutes. The afternoon slipped into evening, and as the sun went down, I found myself sitting with Teresa on the patio while Jenna was inside grabbing something. Teresa turned to me, a glint of amusement in her eyes. "Thanks for putting up with our family quirks, Michael. I know we're a bit much." I laughed, feeling my stomach flip at the intensity in her gaze. "No, not at all. You all seem close. It's nice." She looked away briefly, as if considering something, then glanced back at me. "It's funny, isn't it? Family. It's all so complicated, yet somehow so simple." The words hung in the air. I wanted to ask her what she meant, but Jenna came back outside, and the moment passed. Later, as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. It was the first time I felt the weight of what was happening between Teresa and me. Over the next few months, I became a regular guest at their house. Jenna and I had become close friends, almost as if I were a part of the family. Teresa and I shared little moments, a look, a laugh that lingered just a bit too long. I knew it was wrong to feel this way, but the thrill of it was intoxicating. One Friday evening, Jenna invited me to stay over after a late-night movie marathon at their house. Tom had gone to bed, and Teresa joined us for a while, wrapped in a blanket on the couch next to me. There was a moment when the movie ended, Jenna nodded off, and I found myself alone with Teresa again. The tension in the room was thick, and I felt myself inching closer to her. She looked at me, and for the first time, there was no trace of humor or casualness in her gaze. She knew. I knew. And yet, we both stayed silent. The moment was broken when Jenna stirred awake, stretching and laughing about the film's plot. Teresa got up, excusing herself to bed, but as she left, she brushed my shoulder gently, a touch so brief yet charged with meaning. That night, lying on the couch, I knew I'd crossed an invisible line. Teresa was older, married, a mother. This was a boundary I'd never intended to approach, let alone cross. But somehow, every time I was near her, I felt myself slipping deeper into something I didn't know how to escape. In the following weeks, the tension built. Teresa would occasionally text me, asking about my day, checking in. We'd see each other at the gym, sometimes sharing a coffee afterward, our conversations light but never quite innocent. One day, she invited me over while Jenna was out with friends. I hesitated but accepted, telling myself it was harmless. When I arrived, the house was quiet, and Teresa greeted me with a glass of wine. We sat on the patio, talking about everything and nothing, the evening slipping by in a haze of laughter and glances that lasted a little too long. At one point, Teresa reached across the table, placing her hand over mine. Neither of us moved for a moment, and the silence was deafening. She finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Michael, I don't know what we're doing, but I know I can't stop." The confession was raw, an admission of something we both felt but hadn't said out loud. I knew I should leave, walk away, but I couldn't. There was a pull between us, something magnetic and dangerous that defied reason. As I left that night, my heart was pounding, my mind racing. I was tangled in something far beyond friendship, far beyond curiosity. Teresa was everything forbidden and exhilarating, a secret I couldn't share, a risk I couldn't justify. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when everything came crashing down. I'd gone over to the Hollins place to help Jenna with a college application essay. She'd been stressed about it for days, and Teresa invited me to join them for dinner afterward. Sitting around their table had become a normal part of my week by then. Tom was out of town on business again, and it felt like I was filling a role that shouldn't have been mine. When I arrived, Teresa was in the kitchen chopping vegetables, her hair pulled back, her sleeves rolled up. She flashed me a quick smile as Jenna bounded over, waving the draft she wanted me to review. We worked at the dining room table, laughing as she read through my edits and cracked jokes. Teresa occasionally drifted into the room, her glances at me lingering just a little longer than they should. After dinner, Jenna excused herself, saying she had to call a friend about some homework assignment. That left Teresa and me alone in the living room. She leaned back on the couch, exhaling deeply. "It's nice having you around, Michael," she said, her voice soft. I smiled, unsure of what to say. But then she reached over, her hand resting on my arm, her fingers tracing small circles against my skin. It was such a small gesture, but it felt electrifying. like she was pushing against every rule, every boundary. My heart raced, and I felt that familiar pull again, that dangerous attraction that I knew I should resist but didn't want to. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. I could feel the weight of every unspoken word between us, every glance we'd shared, every time our hands had brushed in passing. "I don't know what's happening here, Teresa," I said quietly, "but it feels like we're playing with fire." She looked away, her hand pulling back as she nodded slowly. "I know. But sometimes life doesn't give us the answers we want." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. It was as if she was giving me permission to feel what I felt, to want what I wanted. I didn't dare say more, didn't dare act on the urge to pull her closer, to cross the line we'd been towing for months. But fate had a way of pushing things forward. A week later, Tom invited me to one of their family barbecues. The invitation felt casual, almost normal, but I could tell there was something else behind it. Tom had become friendlier with me over the weeks, treating me like a second son, but his energy changed. When I arrived, Tom greeted me with a bear hug and a firm pat on the back. "Good to see you, Michael. Glad you could make it," he said, a wide smile on his face. I couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt as I met his eyes. He was a good man, a hardworking guy who had no idea about the silent storm building in his own home. Teresa was in the kitchen, finishing up some last-minute preparations, and Jenna was out back with a couple of her friends, setting up drinks and snacks. I tried to blend in, hoping that my unease wasn't showing, but it felt like I was standing on a fault line, waiting for it to crack open. After dinner, Tom pulled me aside. He was holding a bottle of scotch and a couple of glasses, and he nodded toward the patio. "Come on, Michael. Let's have a drink. I'd love to get to know you better." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, but I nodded, following him outside. We settled into the patio chairs, and Tom poured 2 generous servings, handing one to me. He took a long sip, exhaling contentedly. "You know, Michael, I think Jenna really likes having you around. She talks about you a lot. It's nice to see her happy," he said, looking at me with that same easy smile he always wore. I nodded, my mouth dry. "Yeah, she's a great kid. It's been nice getting to know her." Tom gave me a long, considering look, his smile fading a little. "You know, my family means everything to me. I work hard to make sure they have everything they need. Sometimes that means I'm not around as much as I should be, but it's worth it." His words felt loaded, like he was trying to tell me something without saying it directly. I took a sip of my drink, trying to match his calm demeanor. "You've got a beautiful family, Tom. They're lucky to have you." He nodded, his eyes scanning the yard. Jenna and her friends were laughing by the pool, and Teresa was inside, washing dishes. For a moment, he looked almost sad, like he was carrying a weight he didn't know how to put down. "Marriage is funny, you know," he said after a moment. "You think you know someone, but then life happens. People change. Priorities shift. You start seeing each other differently." I nodded, not sure where he was going with this. "Sometimes I worry that Teresa's not happy," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I'm not the man I used to be. Maybe I've let her down in ways I don't even realize." The guilt hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to tell him that everything was fine, that he was overthinking things, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just sat there, staring at the glass in my hand, feeling the weight of every unspoken secret between us. "Tom," I said finally, my voice shaking a little, "I think you're a good man. Teresa, she's lucky to have you." He smiled, a sad, weary smile. "Thanks, Michael. I appreciate that." The rest of the night passed in a blur. Jenna and her friends laughed and danced by the pool, and Teresa joined them, her laughter ringing out over the music. I watched her, feeling a mixture of desire and regret, knowing that I was crossing a line I couldn't uncross. As the weeks went on, Teresa and I drifted closer. We'd text late into the night, our messages filled with words we couldn't say out loud. Every conversation felt like a step further into a dangerous territory, a place where we both knew we didn't belong but couldn't resist. Then, one evening, I was over at their house while Jenna was out with friends. Teresa and I were sitting in the living room, the lights dim, a glass of wine in each of our hands. She looked at me, her gaze intense, and for a moment, I thought she was going to pull away, to tell me that this had gone too far. Instead, she leaned in, her hand resting on my knee. Her fingers traced small circles against my skin, sending shivers up my spine. I felt my breath catch, my heart racing as she closed the distance between us. "Michael," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can't stop thinking about you." The words were like a spark, igniting something inside me that I'd been holding back for too long. I leaned in, my hand cupping her face as I pressed my lips to hers. It was a gentle kiss at first, hesitant, like we were both testing the waters, but then it deepened, and I felt the weight of every unspoken word between us. We pulled away, breathless, our foreheads pressed together as we tried to catch our breath. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of desire and fear. This can't happen," she whispered, but there was no conviction in her voice. "I know," I replied, but even as I said it, I knew I didn't mean it. We stayed like that for a moment, our hands intertwined, our breaths mingling in the silence. It felt like we were on the edge of something, a cliff we were both terrified to jump off of but couldn't pull away from. Then, the sound of the front door opening shattered the silence. Jenna's voice echoed through the house as she called out, "Mom? Michael? You guys here?" We jumped apart, our hands releasing each other as if we'd been burned. Teresa stood, her hands shaking as she tried to compose herself. "Michael, you should go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, my heart pounding as I grabbed my coat and headed for the door. Jenna greeted me with a bright smile as I passed her in the hallway, her eyes filled with a warmth and trust that made me feel like the worst person in the world. "Leaving already?" she asked, her voice light and cheerful. "Yeah, I should get going." "Got an early morning," I replied, forcing a smile. She nodded, giving me a quick hug before I stepped outside. As I walked to my car, I could feel the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me, a crushing guilt that threatened to consume me. The next few days were a blur of confusion and regret. I couldn't shake the image of Teresa, the feel of her lips against mine, the way she'd looked at me with that mixture of longing and fear. I knew it was wrong, that I was crossing a line that could destroy everything, but the pull between us was undeniable. Then one night I got a text from her. Just one word, "Tonight." I knew what she meant. I knew what she was asking. And I knew that I should say no, that I should put an end to this before it went any further. But instead, I found myself driving to her house, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. When I arrived, the house was dark, except for a single light in the living room. She was waiting for me, her eyes filled with that same intensity I'd seen so many times before. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. She stepped forward, her hand reaching out to mine, and I felt myself slipping further into something I couldn't control. We moved to the couch, our hands exploring, our breaths mingling in the darkness. It was a moment of pure, unrestrained desire, a release of everything we'd been holding back for so long. But as we lay there, tangled together, the reality of what we'd done began to sink in. The next morning, I woke up in her arms, the early morning light filtering through the windows. She looked at me, her expression a mixture of contentment and regret. This can't happen again," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded, but even as I did, I knew it was a lie. We were in too deep, tangled in something that neither of us knew how to escape from. Over the next few weeks, our secret meetings continued, each one more intense than the last. We both knew it was only a matter of time before someone found out, but we were powerless to stop. It was like we were addicted to each other, unable to pull away even though we knew the consequences. Then one night it happened. We were in the middle of a passionate embrace when the front door swung open. Tom stood there, his face a mask of shock and betrayal. He stared at us, his eyes filled with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. What is this?" he stammered, his voice shaking. Teresa froze, her face pale as she stared at him, her eyes wide with fear. "Tom, I can explain," she began, but he held up a hand, cutting her off. "Don't," he said, his voice cold. "I don't want to hear it." He turned to me, his eyes blazing with anger. "And you," he spat, "I trusted you. I welcomed you into my home, into my family. And this is how you repay me." I felt a surge of shame and regret, but I couldn't bring myself to look him in the eye. I knew there was nothing I could say to make this right. "Get out," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Both of you, get out of my house. Teresa's hand tightened around mine, but I pulled away, stepping back. I knew this was the end, that there was no going back from this. As I walked out of the house, I could feel the weight of what I'd done pressing down on me, a crushing guilt that threatened to consume me. I'd betrayed a man who had trusted me, a family who had welcomed me into their lives. And I knew that I would have to live with that for the rest of my life. In the days after Tom caught us, I waited for the fallout, knowing that it was only a matter of time before I'd pay for what I'd done. I barely slept, replaying the moment he walked in, the look of shock and betrayal on his face, the cold fury in his voice as he told us to leave. The regret was heavy, but mixed with it was a strange, residual attachment to Teresa that I couldn't shake. We'd shared something forbidden, intoxicating, and now I was left with the wreckage of what had once been an infatuation I'd let grow far beyond control. But it wasn't long before Tom made his move. One Friday morning, I went to work and found an email waiting for me in my inbox. It was from Tom, sent directly to my work address. There was no subject line and only a single sentence. We need to talk. Meet me at Del Mar Pier at 8 p.m. tonight. I sat there, staring at the screen, my heart racing as I wondered what he had planned. Part of me wanted to ignore the message, to avoid any confrontation. But I knew I couldn't. Tom wasn't the type to make idle threats, and whatever he wanted to say, I knew it was going to be serious. That evening, I drove to the pier, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I braced myself for whatever lay ahead. The sky was darkening, the horizon painted in deep shades of purple and blue as the sun dipped below the water. When I parked, I spotted him immediately, standing at the end of the pier, his silhouette rigid and motionless against the darkening sky. As I approached, he didn't turn around. He waited, his gaze fixed on the ocean, his hands resting on the railing. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice low and steady. I stopped a few feet away, unsure of how to respond. "I didn't think I had a choice," I said, trying to keep my own voice steady. He chuckled, a humorless sound that made my skin crawl. "No, I suppose you didn't." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. We stood there in silence, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore filling the space between us. Finally, he turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "You know, Michael, I trusted you," he said quietly. "I welcomed you into my home, treated you like family. And you repay me by doing this." The shame hit me like a punch to the gut. "Tom, He held up a hand, cutting me off. Just don't. I don't want to hear any apologies. They're meaningless now." He turned back to the ocean, exhaling slowly. "You probably think I'm here to make some sort of dramatic scene, to yell at you, maybe even throw a punch. But that's not my style, Michael. I'm a businessman, and I deal with things in a way that gets results." I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something in his voice, a quiet, controlled anger that was far more intimidating than any threat of violence. "I've thought about this long and hard," he continued, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "And I've come to a decision. You're going to pay for what you did, Michael. But not in the way you think." He pulled out his phone, scrolling through it before handing it to me. On the screen was a photo of Teresa and me, taken from outside a cafe where we'd met a few weeks earlier. We were sitting close, our heads bent together, her hand resting on my arm. The photo was grainy, but it was unmistakably us. I looked up at him, my heart pounding. What is this?" "It's leverage," he said simply. "This isn't the only photo I have, Michael. I've been watching the two of you for a while now. I knew something was going on, but I needed proof, and now I have it." He took his phone back, slipping it into his pocket. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave San Diego. You're going to disappear, and you're not going to have any contact with Teresa or Jenna ever again. If you do, I'll send these photos to everyone you know. Your family, your friends, your coworkers. I'll make sure that everyone sees exactly what kind of man you are." The threat hung heavy in the air, a crushing weight that pressed down on me. I knew he was serious. Tom wasn't the type to bluff, and he had the resources to make good on his threat. "And if I refuse?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, a cold, calculated smile. "If you refuse, I'll ruin you, Michael. I'll make sure you lose your job, that you're blacklisted from every company in the city. I'll make sure that you're left with nothing." I swallowed hard, feeling a surge of panic rise within me. I knew I was trapped, that there was no way out of this. I crossed the line, and now I was paying the price. I understand, I said finally, my voice hollow. He nodded, satisfied. Good. I want you out of here by the end of the week, and if I ever hear that you've been in contact with Teresa or Jenna, well, you know what will happen. He turned and walked away, leaving me standing alone on the pier, the weight of his threat settling over me like a dark cloud. Over the next few days, I packed up my life in San Diego, preparing to leave behind everything I'd built here. I didn't contact Teresa. I knew that would only make things worse. But the pain of leaving her, of cutting off all contact without a word, was almost unbearable. She was a part of me now, woven into my life in a way that I couldn't easily erase. But Tom's words echoed in my mind, a constant reminder of the consequences if I stayed. I knew he was watching, that he was waiting for me to slip up, and so, I left, disappearing from San Diego without a trace. For a while, I drifted from city to city, trying to find a place to start over. I found a job in Los Angeles, working for a small marketing firm, but it wasn't the same. I felt like a ghost, haunted by the life I'd left behind, by the mistakes I'd made. Months passed, and I tried to move on, to forget about Teresa and the life I'd almost had. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd left a part of myself behind in San Diego, a part of me that I'd never get back. Then, one day I received a letter in the mail. It was unmarked, with no return address, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from Teresa. Michael, I don't know where you are, or if you'll even read this, but I needed to tell you. I needed to tell you that I still think about you. Every day. I know what we did was wrong, and I know that we both paid the price for it, but I can't help how I feel. I miss you, more than I can put into words. And I need you to know that, no matter what happens, you'll always have a place in my heart. Love, Teresa. The letter was like a lifeline, a reminder that I wasn't alone in this, that she felt the same way I did. But it was also a painful reminder of the life I'd left behind, of the love that had cost me everything. For weeks, I debated whether to respond. I knew the risks, that Tom would likely find out, that he'd make good on his threat if he discovered that I was still in contact with Teresa. But the pull was too strong, the need to reconnect too powerful to ignore. Finally, I wrote back, a short, simple letter that I hoped would reach her without drawing attention. Teresa, I don't know if this will reach you, but I need you to know that I feel the same way. Leaving was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I did it because I couldn't stand the thought of hurting you or Jenna. I miss you too. And no matter what happens, I'll always love you. Michael. The weeks that followed were a blur of anxiety and anticipation, waiting for a response, hoping that she would write back. And then, one day a letter arrived. Michael, thank you for writing back. I know this is dangerous, that we're risking everything by staying in touch. But I can't let you go. I can't pretend that what we had didn't matter. I'm willing to take the risk if you are. The words filled me with a renewed sense of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to be together. Over the next few months, we continued to exchange letters, carefully avoiding any mention of Tom, of the life we'd left behind. But fate had other plans. One evening, as I was leaving my apartment, I noticed a familiar figure standing in the shadows, watching me. My heart dropped as I recognized him. Tom, his face set in a grim expression as he stepped forward. You didn't think I'd find out, did you? He said, his voice cold and menacing. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. I could see the fury in his eyes, the rage simmering beneath the surface. You betrayed me, Michael. You lied to me, and now you're going to pay for it. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through it before holding it up for me to see. On the screen was a photo of one of my letters to Teresa, the words clear and unmistakable. I warned you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I told you what would happen if you stayed in contact with her. And now you're going to see just how serious I am. He stepped closer, his face inches from mine, his voice low and menacing. By the time I'm done with you, you'll have nothing left, Michael. Nothing. And then he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, my heart pounding with fear and dread. The days that followed were a nightmare. True to his word, Tom began his campaign of revenge, using every resource at his disposal to destroy my life. My boss called me into his office one day, a look of disappointment on his face as he handed me a termination letter. "I'm sorry, Michael," he said, his voice heavy with regret, "but there have been allegations. Things that we can't ignore. We have to let you go." I knew it was Tom's doing. He'd made sure that I was blacklisted, that no company in the city would hire me. My reputation was in ruins, my career destroyed. I tried to fight back, to clear my name, but every door was slammed in my face. Desperate, I reached out to Teresa, hoping that she could help, that we could find a way to escape from this nightmare. But she never responded. Days turned into weeks, and still, there was no word from her. It was as if she'd vanished, leaving me to face the consequences alone. In the end, I had no choice but to leave the city, to start over somewhere far away from the life I'd once known. I drifted from place to place, struggling to rebuild, to find a sense of purpose in a world that felt hollow and empty. But no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape the memories, the pain of what I'd lost. Teresa was gone, my career destroyed, my life shattered beyond repair. And all I was left with was the bitter knowledge that I'd paid the price for my mistakes, that I'd lost everything in the pursuit of a love that was never meant to be. As the years passed, I learned to live with the emptiness, to accept the fact that I would never be whole again. But every now and then, I would find myself thinking of her, of the life we might have had, if only things had been different. And in those moments, I knew that, despite everything, I would always carry a piece of her with me, a reminder of the love that had cost me everything. Years passed, and I found myself drifting from city to city, job to job, with each place feeling less like home than the last. The scars from that time in San Diego ran deep, a reminder of the life I'd almost had and the price I paid for crossing a line I should never have touched. Some days I convinced myself that I'd moved on. But then I'd catch a glimpse of a woman with dark hair, or hear the name Teresa in passing, and everything would come rushing back. The regret, the memory of her laugh, the tension in the air between us. I couldn't escape the feeling that, somewhere out there, Teresa was living her life just as haunted by what we'd shared. Or maybe that was just my mind's way of justifying it all, of believing that what we'd had wasn't as hollow as it seemed now. I tried to reach out once more, and email this time. A simple message, testing the waters to see if maybe the years had softened the lines between us. I wanted to know if she was okay, if life had returned to normal for her. But I never received a reply. And slowly, the question shifted in my mind. Maybe she was better off without a reminder of those mistakes, and maybe it was time I stopped letting them define me. But in quiet moments, when the world slowed, I'd sometimes let myself wonder about her. I pictured her living in that same house, maybe sitting by the same pool, watching the years roll by as the rest of the world carried on. I wondered if she ever looked back on those days with regret, or if, like me, she held on to the fleeting moments of happiness we'd stolen from a life we could never truly share. Then, one autumn evening, I received a letter in the mail. There was no return address, just my name scrawled across the envelope in handwriting I would have recognized anywhere. I held it in my hands for what felt like an eternity, 1,000 possibilities flashing through my mind as I considered whether to open it. When I finally did, the message inside was brief, just a single line. "Michael, I think about you too." No explanation, no signature, just a whisper from the past, a reminder that, even now, there was a part of her that hadn't let go. I folded the letter, slipping it back into the envelope, unsure of what to do with the words she'd left me. Part of me wanted to write back, to reopen the door to a connection that had cost us both so much. But I hesitated, knowing the risk, knowing that a single step toward her could bring everything crashing down once more. As I sat there, the letter heavy in my hands, I realized that the choice was mine alone. I could move forward, or I could let the past claim me once again. And for the first time in years, I felt the weight of that decision settle over me, uncertain if I'd ever truly find the strength to let her go.